Thank you very much. We have about 10-15 minutes for questions. I ask that there is a roving mic, and because we're recording this, if you could signal that you want to ask a question, and then someone with the mic can come round so we can make sure we capture everything. Can you say name and institution before you ask as well?
Sure.
That'd be great.
Paul Goodwin, Goldsmiths College. Today I'm representing Goldsmiths College today. No, Irit, I wanted to thank you for your usual eloquent exposition and treatise on geography. And as for someone who is who considers myself a kind of refugee from academic geography, and recently kind of decamped into the realm of contemporary art and the art world, I find the way in which you comment on geography, the way in which you kind of expound on alternative understandings of geography, for me is very inspirational. But I wanted to just really ask you a very quite prosaic question in relation to your conception of exhaustive geography, which I'm very interested in. You mentioned in that this idea of relational geographies. And I wondered if you could just maybe expound a little bit about that and how it relates to this concept. And I wondered whether in your idea of relational geographies you were thinking perhaps or dialoguing with the idea of Glissant's idea of the poetics of a relation.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in a project, or at least in my projects, I always have to kind of invent myself a terminology. And right now, it seemed most relevant for this project to think about exhausted geographies. But relational geography is really central to sort of. I'll backtrack for a second. I'm sort of constantly looking for an intellectual and political position that does not involve resistance, because people of my generation have spent decades, resisting with zero effect. And so the sort of, instead of just, giving up and being tired and so on, it seems really important to try and produce trajectories of unthinking things, so you're not held captive, by logics or orders or things that you then have to spend vast amounts of time resisting. So relational geography actually arose not through Glissant, but through an exhibition that Okwi and Wezor organized, which I think we've talked about before, Paul, which is called The Short Century, which he did just before he did Documenta 11, and which I think was one of the most extraordinary exhibitions of the past decade, and which was about African liberation movements between 1948 and 1989. So it was a whole series of wars of decolonization, national liberation, and so on. And one of the things that I started thinking about, I went to see the exhibition 4 times in 4 different sites because I kept not believing that I saw what I saw, or thought and I would go home and think, but this is enormously radical, and then think, no, can't possibly be that, and then take a plane and go see it in, some other place. And one of the things that emerged from me from that argument, and you have to think this is 2001, so the sort of, the world is getting rewritten through the map of terrorism, so-called, was that through a kind of putting African liberation movements and wars of decolonization, of national self-constitution as the dominant geography, from which everything emanates, he was doing 2 things. One, which was just terribly satisfying, which was stealing from the West its one of its greatest conceits, which is it is the source of radicality. And all radicality emanates from the West and then gets imported elsewhere to inform other political conflicts and so on. Because the first time I came home from this exhibition, I pulled out some mid-century biographies that I had on my shelf. Really arbitrary, people like Sartre and Camus and Habermas, just stuff I had. And again, they said the same thing. I was liberated, I came into political consciousness with the Algerian conflict. And so the sort of it became very clear that the political turn came from Africa. It wasn't student movements, it wasn't urban kind of guerrilla resistance. It was a model that had come from Africa. So I thought, this is really interesting. But the other thing that emerged was that, usually that's me. The other thing that emerged was that it became possible to kind of give a historical antecedents to something called Al-Qaeda. Let's say there is something called Al-Qaeda, which we all have our doubts about, but let's say that there is, then it becomes possible to kind of produce, to make it not that which comes at us as a surprise, unexpected and so on, but to link it in long historical lines to moments of resistance and to create a relational geography between Mau Mau in Kenya and ETA in Spain and PLO in Palestine and Brigada Rossa in Italy as a kind of relational geography, and which then kind of does away with hegemony and breach, which is how terror is always constituted, as hegemony and breach, and the breach comes as a surprise. Not a government declaring war on you, but something you cannot protect yourself against. Exploding buildings, exploding bodies, exploding cars, exploding planes, whatever. And so relational geography became incredibly important in order to bring together things for which there is no narrative to bring together, And I've been playing around with a lot of instances of it, as how to write geography away from land masses and lines of historical continuity. And so I should look at Glissant. I really should look at Glissant. But
moving away from binaries towards dispersal. I guess relational geographies kind of helps with that. Thank you.
Yeah, and the other thing about the sort of the relational geography of the terroristic is that it's embedded in, it doesn't follow the logic of borders. It's not about breaching a protective line. It's enfolded and embedded within, and therefore, all of the sort of lines of division and containment can't sustain, what they're supposed to sustain. And so it becomes, geographically an incredibly rich kind of tool to unwork with.